Good afternoon. Welcome today, this afternoon, to continue with a series of staff seminars. It's a pleasure to have you around. This afternoon, we have the speaker, Niels Boender, hopefully pronouncing your name right. He's a PhD student at the University of Warwick in the UK. A student of David, the student of David Anderson, a friend of the department. I think it's such influence that you're quickly informed about this series of seminars. Niels is going to speak to us about a topic titled plethora of potentially subversive activity, Wanjohi Mungau, Mau, and the local politics of Uhuru in Nyeri from the period 1959 to 1965. His presentation will hope bring, try to fill the historical gap between the end of the Mau here, unmute, so to speak, it will unmute the struggle for independence and the role of former Mau, the loyalists, and others in defining the meaning of Uhuru. It is also Niels' aim to trace how the counterinsurgency project of late colonialism was embedded and persisted in the years before independence. Niels, you're welcome. Thank you very much.
I hope that people online can hear me. So first of all, thank you all for coming, especially to those on Zoom. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then I look forward to doing a Q&A. I'm especially interested in hearing what you guys think, how you react to what I'm saying, because a lot of this stuff is very recent research, and I haven't yet road tested it, so I'm very interested to see what everybody thinks. So let me start with a story, and that story takes us to Nairobi. Middle of the night, dark police cars slip around the city, and dozens of men and women are lifted from their beds, including the later famous Wambui Waiaki. These people are informed that they've been served with restriction orders under the Preservation of Public Security Act. It had only gone into operation months before. Soon, they will be on planes to Lamu on the coast to begin their extrajudicial sentences. Elsewhere, in Laikipia, in Moranga, and especially in Nyeri, the provincial administration are picking up dozens more. In Nyeri, nighttime and sometimes 23-hour curfews are instituted, and tribal policemen begin the process of screening, dispatching hundreds through local courts to be fined or subjected to custodial sentences. Now, you may be surprised to hear that I'm not talking about Operation Jock Scott, the operation which arrested Kenyatta and the major Kenya African Union leaders in 1952, which accompanied the start of Kenya's state of emergency. In fact, the night in question is the 8th of July, 1960, half a year after the end of the state of emergency. And its name, Operation Milltown in Nairobi, and Coachman elsewhere in Central Province. Now, what makes this interesting, first of all, is that this is the first major security operation by the colonial state after the end of the state of emergency, but it's also the first one after the Lancaster House Conference, which set out a timetable roughly towards internal self-government and brought in multiple African ministers. But what can this tell us? I think, for one, it can tell us what the colonial state was anxious about, what they thought they were fighting. They're no longer, at this point, fighting generic notion of African nationalism by 1960. African nationalists were in fact sitting on the Council of Ministers. What they were fighting was first and foremost subversion, a ubiquitous term in both colonial and post-colonial state discourses that expressed a way of understanding society and political opposition. In fact, subversion was a self-producing category of political criminalization, a line beyond which Milltown / Coachman, also known as other things. Who were these subversives, the men and women that were detained? They stand for? Why were they arrested? And this brings me to thinking about the local politics, the aftermath of the Mau Mau uprising. Now, I would suggest that there is a lacuna, a silence, if you will, after the violent subaltern politics of Mau Mau. Now, as many of you will know, Mau Mau is one of the most debated, if not the most debated and written about period of Kenya's history. It was subject in the 1970s, Kenya's equivalent of the historical strike, tribal civil war, or anti-colonial revolution. And there have been so many works that deal with the role of women, the place of the camps, and the long prehistory of the Mau Mau. Then think about the books that deal with the post-colonial state, which I would uncharitably suggest are primarily interested in the comings and goings at Lancaster House, the elite. What falls in between these two stories is a sharp historiographic shift from the subaltern radical politics of the emergency to the moderate constitutionalism of the post-emergency period, a period where the rivalry between Odinga and Mboya is the main story. Now, there are exceptions to this work. I would be amiss to, for instance, point out Tabitha Kanogo's 1987 work on squatters, which is still particularly useful in this regard, or the more recent work of Nick Githuku. But what these works miss, I believe, the link between what's happening at grassroots at the subaltern level and of local politics. An understanding of that local politics. Mau Mau will forever remain a black box. And what I mean by that is that there is this assertion, pretty ubiquitous in Kenyan discourse, I think, that Mau Mau led to independence, or at least the armed struggle led to independence. This is an empty assertion without granting that period in between historical meaning. And it will just become another part of national myth-making and only polarize. Mau Mau leaves the story of Kenya's independence roughly in 1956 with the death of Dedan Kimathi, or more charitably, Lancaster House. How then can you explain Milltown? Mau Mau isn't exceptional in the history of anti-colonial revolt. It's also not exceptional in the history of Kenyans' engagement with political power. Mau Mau deserves to be placed into a longer genealogy of Kenyan politics. It doesn't just stretch backwards to resistance, but forwards into the post-colonial period. And this has to be done from below, or at least from the middle, because it's very difficult sometimes to come up with the story from below. There are three arguments I would like you to consider. And then the first one is the reason why we're here, the muted histories. I believe that there is a muted history, legacies of Mau Mau. Now, and that's because there are two mostly predominant views, the official and the radical view. On the one hand, there is the traditional view of symbolic forgetting, that the story that was expressed by the Kenyatta state in the 1960s. The fact that the victory of independence meant that continuing Mau Mau sentiment was unnecessary. Reconciliation and reintegration happened, and that silence about the Mau Mau good for national unity. The other view, we might call the revolutionary view or the quasi-Marxist view, tells a very different story. Now, I have to praise scholars like Maina Wikinyathi and Shirez Garani, because they're in fact the only ones to discuss some of these organizations that emerge after the end of the emergency. What they don't do, I think, is evaluate post-Mau Mau politics. They're intent on proving this continuing revolutionary spirit, an unbroken chain of resistance from pre-colonial Nandi warriors through Mau Mau to Mwakenya and the Second Liberation. I don't think that's sufficient to explain the changing nature of activism. the sometimes problematic forms that it takes that have legacies in the present. A scholar like Anais Angelo, in her explanation of the crystallization of the Kenyan, focuses exclusively on those last Meru generals, Field Marshal Baimungi, Mariama, that come out of the forest at the end of 1963. Some of them go back, and eventually they go down in a blaze of violence in early 1965. But I think by focusing on that small group, we end up replicating the symbolic narrative of the Kenyatta state, try to emphasize that only a small group of people resisted. What we need for more complexity in this story, what was the political life of the average ex-Mau Mau, of the average ex-Kenyan? And I think what can help us answer, and what really was, quote, the struggle for independence, and what did it do between 1956 and 1963? Because I think we can all agree that it's more than the comings and goings of the Lancaster House. Now, the second key argument that I want to make towards this point is about the vibrancy and the complexity of local politics at this time. And I think what's crucial in that is that we have to avoid the hard boundary between subversion and constitutionalism, between moderates and radicals, because that line is non-existent in the mind of at the time. And if it was, people flitted back and forward. And the colonial state at the time was moving the goalposts of what constituted subversion so quickly, sometimes hard to keep up when you're reading the sources. One day's radical that might need to be detained, minister very soon thereafter. This is a very fast-moving period. Now, neither is the divide a clean ex-Mau Mau, ex-loyalist divide, and I think that's a mistake some of the radical scholars make. I think useful in understanding how these alliances with groups change is the concept that John Lonsdale gives us of moral ethnicity. He argues that the pre-Mau Mau period, the way in which the alliances were shaped, was about differences about how best to achieve moral adulthood, whether it be through government service and therefore becoming a loyalist, or through violent resistance. Now, I think this process carries forward. The differing definitions of how to achieve moral adulthood was reshaped by the counterinsurgency effort. Counterinsurgency effort created new ways in which to advance in central Kenyan society. And then you enter party politics into that as well. Wars, that the violence that takes place reshapes and crystallizes alliances. Now, if we accept that to a certain extent in central Kenya, Mau Mau was a civil war, then we have to study the period afterwards from the perspective of post-Civil War societies with a rich comparative literature. How do we understand the logics of reconciliation, vengeance, restitution? These are the ideas that I think we need to consider when we think about Kenya's pre-independence period. Now, I think it's key to say here as well that this subaltern politics of Uhuru wasn't limited to the Kikuyu at all. There are dimensions in Nairobi, on the coast, in the Rift. And while I don't have time to discuss them now, they could provide very fruitful future avenues of scholarship. I think thus far the work of people like Julie MacArthur on the Luya and Gabby Lynch on the Kalenjin are good examples of dense local histories of this short period where the Regional Boundaries Commission was reshaping what the future of Kenya would look like. These books remain small parts of much wider, sometimes century-long stories. What this period has in common all over Kenya is that there are vernacular reactions to the promise of independence, the fears that come with that, the hopes that come with that, and how they were manipulated by political leaders. And my third point that I want to make, grassroots politics was also repressed. During the period between the end of the emergency and independence, counterinsurgency project of the colonial state continued. It was adapted by a generation of post-colonial leaders who had to work and attempted to control a new febrile democratic culture. And I think the result of which, to use the contemporary term, form of astroturf politics, or to use older political science terminology, a politics of patronage and clientelism that had the allure of the grassroots. And I think if you think about that, patronage and clientelism, while trying to sell grassroots politics, you might think about the present. as well. Let me, before I properly dive into the body of my talk, I just want to mention methodology. There, the second big silence comes in, is that the primary source base for what I'll be talking about today, based on taken to the UK, where they were kept in a small house in Milton Keynes until 2011, when they were released after the High Court case related to Mau Mau. And since then, historians have been able to use them and pick through them. Now, I should say very importantly is I'm a big advocate for repatriating these archives. They belong in Kenya, and the ones that are taken from Sri Lanka belong in Sri Lanka, etc. But these sources are particularly useful, and they haven't been completely used by historians yet. Historians use the files that relate to the emergency itself quite well. There is a whole battery of files that relate to that in-between period that I'm going to be talking about today, haven't yet been used by historians. Now, beyond these files, I've also done some interviews in Kenya, and I hope to do some more. And the past 7 weeks, I've been working in the Kenya National Archives, and particularly the last 10 minutes of the talk will be drawn from material that I found here. Okay, now to dive into the body of the talk. And to begin, I want to talk briefly about the emergency. But the emergency seen as through the reverse end of a telescope. The emergency seen from its consequences. And that story begins roughly in around 1950. Before 1956, the colonial state in its fight against Mau Mau often improvising. But by 1956, crystallizes in a certain way. And in order to think about that, I think we need to understand the way the colonial state saw the Mau Mau. Now, the way they saw them in my reading of the files is a pathology of racialized African bodies. And this has been well discussed in the past. But it's also, and I think this is missing from the scholarship, a pathology of racialized African body politic. The fight against Mau Mau was replete with disease-based metaphors, and the methods implemented against it were first and foremost biopolitical. Now, I think the mistake some historians have made, like Caroline, take the fact that these disease metaphors are used to think that this was a genocidal project, this was an eliminationist project by the British. In fact, when you have a patient, you're not trying to kill the patient, you're trying to heal it. And that's not an excuse. There was extreme violence that occurred in the detention camps, but it was violence that served a purpose. Now, what was that purpose? That purpose was to remake Central Kenya, to make it safe for another generation of colonial rule. Even by the late 1950s, colonial administrators were talking about independence sometime around the year 2000. So how did they understand the emergency? They wanted to quarantine the infected. They wanted social medicine in the form of land consolidation and villagization. And they wanted to boost the immune system of Central Kenya by elevating this class of loyalists. And if you actually look at the files that relate to the pipeline, the dominant logic seems to be one of release, and that seems counterintuitive. How is release the primary dynamic? But so much of the violence that occurred in the camps was in order to push people through this rehabilitation pipeline, in order to get them to be clean as quickly as possible. And that's where a lot of the punitive beating work. That means that we have to understand the logic of release. Now, central to that logic of release were the loyalists. Loyalists were the people on which the colonial administration wanted to build the new Central Kenya. Because when a detainee was to be released, it wasn't the district commissioner that made the final decision. It was the local chief or headman. And when someone was exiled, sent to Hola, in essence, it was because the local loyalists wouldn't have you back. Loyalists were the sturdy yeoman farmer, land consolidation, and Swinnerton plan, supposed to turn into this elite Central Kenya, and former detainees were to work on their shambas as landless employees. Overall, I would describe this project of the late emergency, as one of coercive reconciliation. Now, reconciliation, we tend to have a positive connotation, but in fact, it can be violent, it can be suppressing of certain ideas and memories, and it can simply want to diffuse one side. But detainees resisted this project of coercive reconciliation. Many had particularly difficult homecomings from release after they were released from the camps. They were often handed straight over to local loyalists, people that they'd been fighting on a very intimate level. They were restricted to their home location for 6 months in most cases. They had to report twice daily to the people that they'd been fighting, and they were subjected to grueling communal labor with other members of their community. J.M. Kariuki, in his autobiography, writes very striking about his release from detention. He's welcomed home. There is this feast with goat meat. And the next morning, I imagine he's quite hungover, at 6 a.m., woken by a bugle. And the bugle is calling him and his entire village to communal labor. And that tragedy of homecoming leads for many to remobilization. But for many, it was far, far worse than that. People came home to shattered families, major economic disparities that had been created by the emergency. Their children might have been missing 6 years of education. Think only of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's A Grain of Wheat to think about the tragedy of homecoming so many of these ex-detainees. So there was this propensity towards remobilization. It wasn't 100% either, and that's the complexity. Laura Huttenbach has written a biography of Japhet Thambu in Meru, a general in the Mau Mau. And in fact, he has a good relationship with the local district officer, and his farm hasn't been taken away. So he ends up being fairly moderate, fairly pro-government. He even becomes a district official for Kadu in 1961. What we have in this process of homecoming is a reshaping of the kaleidoscope. It's new categories that have been created, have and have not, that in many ways replicate the old divides, but not 100%, and that'll become more clear as we go forward. Now, there were also other forms of resistance, more subaltern forms of resistance. Gucho Kikoyo, who writes a biography, he turns, after a bad experience with the local chief after his release, he turns to armed robberies. And in his mind, there isn't a clear line between Mau Mau and armed robberies of European families. But what all these people have in common, from Kariuki to Thambu to Gikoyo, is that these are people that are dealing with an aftermath. Kenya is a post-Civil War space. It needs to be understood from that perspective. Now, of course, there is politics to this. Politics in central Kenya from about 1956 is under the so-called Kutz franchise, but more importantly, it's shaped by loyalist certificates. Essentially, you were only allowed to vote if the district commissioner said you were a loyalist. And that meant, and this is important to realize for the whole rest of Kenya's history, is that it entered democratic politics under a severe blanket of repression. That repression tried to graft the project of coercive reconciliation that I've discussed onto the political system. Like Britain of the 18th century, only the worthy landowners that had proved their faith to government had a say in political representation. And the peasants were expected to pay their taxes and accept their lot. So what this process did is it raised a class of elite educated people that had more often than not sat out the emergency and were related to loyalist families, albeit not in the Home Guard themselves. And these people were invested in the retention of developmentalist capitalism that characterized late colonialism, but also encouraged reconciliation between different factions in order to build their own power base, because they knew that one day there would be one man, one vote, and people that had been at least vaguely supportive of Mau Mau made up the majority in places in central Kenya. So through them, men like Julius Kiano, Bernard Mate, Jeremiah Nyaga, unity, let us forget the past, and Harambee became the watchwords of Kenya's independence. Now, in order to support them, they needed parties. Now, national political parties, colony-wide parties, weren't allowed under the emergency. But parties were allowed at the district level from about 1957. And these district parties have been described in the scholarship basically as ethnic bailiwicks, as the formation of the sort of kingpin process in Kenyan politics, the ultimate expression of divide and rule. And this is true to a certain extent. But these parties are more complex, and no scholarship has yet been done on these district parties, and I think they're very important to study. Many of them included more than one ethnicity. For example, the Nakuru District Congress was a very diverse party. Speakers like Tom and Boyer were invited from Nairobi, and the beginning of the national organization was a merger. More importantly, and maybe more interestingly to this talk, these parties were complex local bodies that brought together very recent enemies. Often were completely dominated by ethnic. So, if you read the reports, the special branch reports of the meetings of these organizations, what I'm most struck by is that on the one hand, you have speeches that are praising reconciliation, and on the other hand, calls for headmen and chiefs to be removed and land to be distributed for free. Even if the explicit divides of the Mau Mau period are no longer being discussed, and they're certainly not being discussed in colonial files, you can see that they're continuing under the surface. In Nairobi, which is the biggest district party, the Nairobi People's Convention Party, which is sometimes uncharitably, I think, been described as basically Tom and Boyer's political vehicle, even there were very fractious internal divisions. There was a group called the Mutangiri, which began as an effectively ex-detainee rights organization that ended up becoming quite a large group of armed stewards at MPCP rallies, of which the colonial state was particularly terrified. Then, in central Kenya itself, there was Julius Kiano. Julius Kiano, who had been educated in the West, and who established a political machine by having multiple parties that basically carbon copied the same constitution in his constituency. Because the constituencies at the time went across multiple districts. So he had Kiambu Freedom Party, the Democratic Party of Fort Hall, now. But what's striking about these organizations is that while he was in control of them, many of their office bearers were ex-detainees. So that's a big story as we go forward. But in particular, as the title of my presentation indicates, the one organization I want to highlight is the Nyeri Democratic Party. To point out the situation in Nyeri at the time, there were 20,000 former detainees in the district, out of only 100,000 adult males. And there wasn't a political party yet. Now, the reason there wasn't a political party is simple to explain, because Kiano, while he was the sort of Kikuyu kingpin during this period, his constituency didn't stretch all the way north to Nyeri. Nyeri was officially under Embu. It was combined with Embu in a constituency. And because Embu had far more loyalist certificates than Nyeri did, Jeremiah Nyaga easily won the election in 1998, which meant that there wasn't a Nyeri member of parliament. So it was harder to establish a kind of natural political party. There was a group in Nyeri, in fact, the Nyeri District African Association. That was the party of Chief Mungau, ex-senior Chief Mungau, I should say. And it was effectively a loyalist vehicle, and it was recognized as such by the colonial state, because at first the colonial state had only allowed loyalist associations. Into this vacuum entered Wanjohi Mungau. Now, Wanjohi Mungau is an interesting character because he actually wasn't detained. He was briefly arrested for a pass offense, but he didn't go through the pipeline like so many others. He had been restricted to his home, basically house arrest, publishing a newspaper, Habari za Kenya, which had taken an African nationalist line during the emergency. He founded, together with some associates, this organization, the Nyeri Democratic Party. And it was founded in the latter months of 1958, but by 1959, when it reached its height, it had 6,000 to 7,000 members who were mainly ex-detainees. And they included J.M. Kariuki and Tom Gachowi, who would later become MP for Laikipia. By April 1959, colonial state recognized that, quote, the NDP and the District African Association had lined up as pro and anti-government parties. And they described the membership of this party as such, quote, the majority of the partly educated politicos, ex-detainees, township corner boys, the anti-government element. In the collective terms they used to describe these people, bush politicians. Worthy to pause on that concept for a second. It encapsulates what subaltern politics was at this time. People radicalized by experience rather than education, that were influential voices at their local level that might not have access to the resources at the district or higher level. And there are many sneering quotes, racist quotes from the colonial administration about the NDP founders. For instance, one said, "They are of such low caliber that it is doubtful whether the intelligentsia will even tolerate their leadership." And I think that's important to point out as well. This concept of the intellectuals, which was very important to the colonial state at the time. This wasn't necessarily loyalists, chiefs and headmen, but head teachers, progressive farmers, the people in a sense that had sat out the emergency. And these were the people that the colonial state wanted to build on. Now, as you can imagine, this party was refused registration in July 1959 on the grounds that it would prejudice land consolidation and therefore the post-war settlement project of coercive reconciliation. Now, while I don't want to get into the weeds of colonial legislation, even though I could talk about that a lot more during the Q&A, the administration had huge power under what was called the Societies Ordinance. And then, by not registering a party, they could criminalize all public meetings by a body and membership of such a group, simply by executive fiat. Now, in response to not being registered, Wanjohi Mungau was said to, quote, regard the situation in a philosophical light, because he is firmly convinced, probably quite rightly, that a political party must emerge ere long in Nyeri district, and it is only a matter of time before the political battle commences. Essentially, he could wait until parties were more openly allowed after Lancaster House, and then he could become the local leader. But things didn't go that way. Mungau would not become the kingpin of Nyeri, because after not being registered, Special Branch reported that talk in Mungau's office had become wilder and wilder. There was even discussion, they said, of murdering loyalists. Quote, it does demonstrate once again the Kikuyu penchant towards violence. The ill will evident towards loyalists bodes no good to the future. Now that quote, there are 2 points. First of all, there is this pathological fear of subversion. Secondly, there is a fear that politics will reverse the gains of the emergency years. And ex-detainees as a class are seen as a threat to the project of coercive reconciliation. In August 1959, Wanjohi Mungau and his associate Mugo Moringa are placed on restriction order, part of Operation Pied Piper, which is another one of the big colonial operations. Their followers try to restart the party as the Nyeri Progressive Party. But what's interesting is at the same time, someone returns to Nyeri. And that man is Joseph Mthenge. And Joseph Mthenge was the general secretary of Mboya's party in Nairobi. He gets restricted back to his home district of Nyeri in that same Operation Pied Piper. Now, that's more than a coincidence, because the first thing that Joseph Mthenge does when he's back home is form a new party, the Nyeri Independence Movement. He explicitly says is a wing of the Kenya Independence Movement, which is the party that Mboya and Odinga attempt to form in 1959. And when Mthenge writes to the district commissioner to found this party, he says, quote, there is a widespread dissatisfaction with the NDP, and in particular, its effect of dividing the people into loyalists and non-loyalist groups. So what we hear of is explicit evidence of the Nairobi sort of political elite, the people that know that they're going to be in charge of the country, encouraging reconciliation in order to build their own power base. And the colonial state encourages this. They say they hope that the educated leaders will stamp out subversion. J.M. Kariuki, who at this point is in the NDP, writes about how Julius Kiana was quietly discouraging the party. And remember that at the time, Kiana was still seen as a radical nationalist, yet he is discouraging this kind of activity. Now, what are the ideals of the NDP? What do they stand for? Now, this is more difficult to gather because we're relying on colonial sources and the odd memoir. But we know a few things, and I would describe their ideals under 3 rubrics: restitution, redistribution, and retribution. Restitution in the sense that what was lost during the emergency has to be restored. Land consolidation has to be reversed or at least redone. And orphans and widows need to get compensation. Then there's redistribution. the opening of the White Highlands and the redistribution of free land, pretty self-explanatory. And thirdly, retribution. Now, maybe they don't want to kill loyalists and headmen, but they certainly want them to stop being in charge. It is, again, more complex than this, because they also speak the language of reconciliation, but only after political victory, only after the Mau Mau aims have been fulfilled, can they begin to reconcile. So that's the sort of formal political history of the NDP in 1959. But things change in 1960. I think one of the reasons it changes is because then the emergency ends. Because then a new group begins to show up in special branch files. Now, on an interesting linguistic point, for months and months, this group is described as the Atangiri. But then Julius Kiano, who at this point is in the Council of Ministers, corrects them and says it's actually the Agatiri, which means protectors. But again, I don't speak Kikuyu, so I'll take pointers from the audience on that. So I might say Atangiri, but that's just because I thought it was that for a very long time as well. So what is the Atangiri? Well, effectively, they are black-shirted stewards of NDP, or at this point, Nyeri Progressive Party meetings. Now, they've taken oaths, and the colonial state knows of about 150 members, but they assume that there are many, many more, because every location in Nyeri has an Agatiri committee. Of the 110 members they know by totally. Now, what explains that? Well, one source tells us that a lot of the members were, quote, the cadets of households which had previously supported Mau Mau. And in other words, basically the younger brothers were the sons of people that had fought in Mau Mau. So what you get here already, even though the emergency is only barely over, you get groups, wider groups that are drawn into this radical narrative. Now, this isn't a silent story at the time. People in the newspapers are writing about this group. One headline in The Nation describes them as the black shirts of Caratina, making an explicit link with the kind of strong-arm divisions of Mussolini's fascist party. Now, they seem to be led by Wanjohi Mungau and Thomas Bikonyo, his associate, and their aims are described as such, and this is a bit of a list, but I think it's worth saying. They aim to unite the Kikuyu, to release Kenyatta, to replace chiefs and headmen, to understudy the existing regular and tribal police, and obtain more land. So they're the same ideas that I was talking about before. The colonial state fears that they appear to have succeeded in bringing together and concentrating the interests of a considerable number of ex-Mau Mau detainees. And they have links with that group in Nairobi I mentioned, the Mutangiri. Their leader in Nairobi, a man called Murray Mutahi, alias General Andaya, was from Nyeri and seemed to travel back and forward quite a lot. And there was a second element to Atangiri subversion, for the Kikuyu, Mumbi, and Kenyatta receipts. Now, you might ask, how are receipts subversive? But effectively, in the middle of 1960, the colonial state discovering squatters or resident laborers on European farms in the Rift Valley are taking oaths. And as part of these oaths, they're receiving little slips of paper that say the letters GMK with a number. And these seem to be sold by the Atangiri. And this is happening mainly in sort of Laikipia. Now, informants tell them that what these notes effectively are promissory notes for European farms. Essentially, promises that after independence, these squatters will, upon showing their receipts to the local leader, get a bit of these farms. And the colonial state fears this especially because this is exactly a threat to their project of willing buyer, willing seller, of keeping together large farms. And many Kikuyu begin to refuse to leave farms because they fear that they'll lose the right that comes from their receipts. Now, selling of these receipts, what happens to the money? They go for about 5 shillings each, which isn't a huge amount of money. It's not as much as it'll eventually cost to buy these farms, but it is a considerable amount of money. And what this money seems to go towards is partially the private expenses of the Atangiri collector. There's certainly a racketeering element. but they also go towards the building of a college, Karatina Commercial College. It was Wanjohi Mungau's effort to replicate Kenyatta's Githunguri Teacher Trainers College, essentially a base for his political organization, which is centered on Karatina. Month after month in the middle of 1960, these reports are coming in. And that's when we come back to Milltown, because Milltown was mostly a response to these rumors, as well as rumors in Nairobi of the Mutangiri. Now, Milltown was done under the Preservation of Public Security Act, which was only brought in a few months before it was first used. Now, what effectively the PPS does, it has two tiers, and under the first tier, it allows movement controls, censorship, restriction without trial, and only under the second tier is detention without trial allowed. But restriction without trial, you've got to understand, is if someone's restricted to, say, Lamu Island, the effect is almost the same as detention without trial. The only difference is that they might be allowed to have their families join them, but they're still not free. It was actually restriction that was used against many of the Pola in the last years of the emergency. So there's this crackdown in July 1960. Curfews are imposed in Nyeri, movement restrictions in Laikipia and Nakuru. 94 people are individually restricted to Lamu, but there's a belief that without this, 500 more would have had to be restricted in a few months, and the second tier of the PPS would have been invoked. So almost for this PR legal reason, there's this crackdown. Now, in the press, John Nottingham, later famous as historian, who was then a district commissioner, described the oathing. He was, I think, the officer for North Petu, if you want to know. He describes the oathing in Nyeri, effectively the activity of the Atangiri, as involving thousands, and, quote, the Kikuyu were returning to the civil war of violent horror and bloodshed from which we were just saved. So essentially what you have here is the colonial state leading a sort of rear guard counterinsurgency action. They're trying to preserve the project they'd run for several years. It was believed that this was done for a particular reason that I think is very important to the future history of politics. This was first and foremost an attempt to control political development. And why do I think that? Because this period in mid-1960 is exactly the time when district parties are becoming branches of KANU, Central Kenya and KADU in other places. Just before Milltown, in fact, Wanjohi Mungau's supporters had voted out of office the KANU steering committee that had been appointed by national leaders, Gishuru and Boya, to run the Nyeri party. And this was described as by the colonial state as, quote, indicating the pattern of things to come, whilst the Atangiri held the district in its grip. The implication of a KANU branch led by Butch politicians, thugs, and ex-detainees was enough even to worry the extreme nationalists, like Boya, and prepared the ground for DC to solicit assistance from KANU leaders put a stop to subversive activities. Now, I think that quote is central to my argument, because what it shows is the link between the sort of neo-Mau Mau subaltern resistance and the new generation of political leaders. Because after that, and I'm not lying, after this moment, every single political rally in central Kenya, if you're applying for a meeting permit, one of the items that are going to be discussed is condemning subversion and oathing. Almost every speech that gets made in central Kenya in 1960, 61, and 62 involves condemning oathing and subversion. Only 2 weeks before Milltown, KANU leaders, including Kiano and the later famous Mwai Kibaki, had met loyalist leaders of the District African Association as, quote, an attempt to heal the breaches in the Kikuyu tribe. And effectively what the loyalists tell them is, you have to suppress the NDP. And they do, because they come out effectively in favor of Milltown. Now, I realize I've been talking for quite long, so the story after this I'm going to rush through slightly. The story becomes slightly murkier as well, and this is what I've been trying to figure out while I'm in Nairobi. Because the party gets absorbed by KANU in part. Joseph Mathenge does become the chair, And while Mungau is in restriction, his followers do get key positions. Of all elections down to the sublocational level, of 486 officials, 224 are ex-detainees and 42 are at Angeri. The youth wing has many ex-detainees in it. And the District African Congress, the Nyeri District African Congress, which is this latest iteration, continues to exist, even Mungau in restriction. And their list of demands is effectively a subaltern anti-Kanu program. In 1962, the District African Congress are seen by the colonial state as, quote, the faction party within Kanu that has got an underground movement that aims to overthrow the present officials of Kanu. Now, I don't have time to go into this, but basically in Nyeri, an alternative movement continues to exist into the post-independence period. They're described in part as the Nyandarua movement due to Nyandarua Tutorial College, which is the successor to Karatina Commercial College. But now I will come to my conclusion. And this conclusion isn't just drawn from the NDP, it's drawn from other groups like the Kenyan Land Freedom Army, the Mutangiri, Kiama Kiamuingi, and the Meru remnants. And that is that Kenyan politics, both in the independence period and thereafter, was dynamic, local, and about ideas, as well as about personalities. So while leaders were trying to form ethnic blocs, under the surface there were bubbling controversies. Kenya's route to independence was in part shaped by these dynamics. For example, the fact that settlement schemes were rushed in the Eastern Rift was out of fear of this continuing Kikuyu subversion. Now, there's also a complexity of post-Mau Mau lives that we need to consider. Not all were repressed. Mau Mau wasn't forgotten, as the narrative sometimes goes. Like their national figureheads, differed on their political attitude. To ask him, what have you done for yourself? Some ex-detainees, like General China, became the great exponents of forgive and forget. I think I would describe this process fundamentally as symbolic incorporation, while the political economy of colonialism. In 1964, the first road in the CBD is named after Kimathi. At the same time, Wanjohi Mungau is sent to Lamu for the second time. It isn't released until 1971. This is reconciliation on a budget. Freedom fighters get 400 plots in Nyandarua. And if you consider that there were already 20,000 ex-detainees in Nyeri alone, that obviously drop in the bucket. Mau Mau wasn't forgotten. It was just remembered in a way that wouldn't threaten the post-colonial settlement. And my final point is about repression. Now, these organizations were not always pleasant. You can describe, in fact, the same grassroots sentiment surging in groups like the Mungiki. There are similarities between the Mungiki and the Angeri. Gangs and crime were a route forward for many ex-detainees. That doesn't mean we shouldn't study them. They reflect how Kenyans fill the vacuum in political life created by a state that exists primarily to serve an elite class and that doesn't represent everyday needs. And grassroots politics isn't isolated from the elite. Atangiri men met Mboya, with some officials speculating that Mboya kept them around as a potential strong-arm group if the colonial regime moved forward. Now, I think similar things can be said for the Mungiki. So there is a lot to study in the links between the past and the present. Also that muting some histories, even in an effort to create an image of national unity, ends up forcing us to repeat the mistakes of the past. And I apologize for going slightly over there.
Thanks, Niels, for that very incisive discussion. I think if I understood Niels, just to capture you in a moment, Niels discusses this ambivalence in what becomes coercive reconciliation. You have this reconciliation, the post reconciliation in the period of detention, right, where you have people who are being released from detention, and they still have to conform in certain ways. So that is controlled reconciliation. Then there's the reconciliation in the post-emergence period. That still is controlled. And this ambivalence of reconciliation actually pervades all the way to the post-election violence 2008, 2008. So it's, indeed, that's something that I would want to, this controlled reconciliation does have a lot of effect in the manner in which, as it concluded, in the manner in which Mau Mau has been remembered. Mau Mau, and we have Mau Mau experts in the house, Mau Mau is only remembered when it only speaks about the victors, but not those who suffered and those who would want their histories also. Indeed, interesting, the particular silence in Kenya's history, which is about the loyalists, and that speaking to loyalists, I think, would be quite interesting if I would want to draw your attention to that. I know our colleague, Dr. Margaret Gachi, is going to speak to this topic, but I think there seems to be something interesting. I just want to draw you to the attention of Professor Professor Teno Diambo's 7 theses of Mau Mau. And just to begin the discussion, maybe we can begin from there. How is this related to your 3 theses that you use to frame your discussion? Where does that come in? You know, Teno Diambo talks about these 7 theses of Mau Mau. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to open up this discussion to those of you who are here, and we'll also hear from those who are on the online. And we'll take 3 questions, those on site, then another 3 questions from those online, and then we'll allow Niels to respond. First 3 questions on site, please. Okay, we have Dr. Mbongi, Dr. Gachihi. That question? Okay, let me see the questions that are there are no questions. Okay. Johnson Karitu is asking, this is the PhD student at the University of Nairobi, who might have the now presenters seem to be having a problem with conceptualization. Might of the source of information is written, which is a problem as far as Mau Mau history is concerned. Go ahead.
All right, so that's using sources. Now, the primary source base that I've used for this, because they're the only sources actually describe these groups, are sort of intelligence reports, communications between officials. Now, these are officials that are in Kenya, on the ground, and their informants, and this is crucial to point out, their informants are local people. So this is the story of Kenyans. This isn't communications between the governor and the Secretary of State for the colonies, right? Like, this is happening on the ground. These are grassroots sources. But I think the point has to be taken 100%, which is that these are still British voices. These are British understandings of what's going on the ground. And I think part of my work, it's very crucial to read through a lot of what is being said. So, for example, there is an urge by the colonial state to see all these organizations essentially as just the latest iteration of Mau Mau. But I think it's very important to sort of, to use the trite term, to read against the grain, try and find out what the truth is behind the colonial logic. And that's why now that I'm in Kenya, I'm trying to use a lot more oral histories, sources from Kenya itself in order to supplement this story. But I take the point 100% that it's a problem if you're just relying on colonial sources. And I think on that, memoirs and sort of vernacular histories are very important to sort of read against the existing sources. But thank you for the question. And on your point, I think the sort of the history of like what defines Kenyan nationalism, who owns Kenyan nationalism. So I think Okambo's thesis, I think what's really interesting about that piece, claim the history of Kenya's strong benefit. Now, I think what's the story that I'm trying to tell is that it's not, and I think this is a problem in a lot of the historiography. Like there's a point that comes, and at that point, Kenya's struggle is over, and it becomes a historical debate about sort of who led to it. What I've been trying to tell here is that actors continue debating all the way up to independence and afterwards, so that there isn't a moment when Mau Mau becomes history. It remains an active part of the post-colonial struggle as well, of the struggle for land redistribution. You can't read the sort of mid-60s struggle, I mean, the sort of KPU and KANU. That needs to be understood as emerging from the local politics of this period. I didn't have time to go into it in the talk. The way in which different organizations and different people sort of pick up old fights in sort of 66, 67, even like in 1969 with the Othing at Gatundu, I think to a large extent, that's a product of the need to kind of shore up the Gikuyu lager because it is divided internally. So the history of like Kenya's struggle for independence, I think there isn't a point that it ends. So that would be my response to the 7 theses, is that maybe the way we should understand it is that what Kenya's history is a struggle between those definitions, and that the sort of on the ground that continues as well. It's not just a debate for historians, it's a debate for everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Niels, for that very wonderful presentation. I am a scholar of Mau Mau, so I get very interested to hear what other scholars have to say about this very complex phenomenon in our history. Maybe 2 comments, and they are not really questions, they are comments. I quote Maloba, Kunyambari Maloba. He tells us that a triumphant liberation movement achieves not only political power, but also power to shape its legacy. I think that's powerful. Now, concerning Mau Mau, and in regard to that view, of course, this foregrounds the contradictions of Mau Mau, of a war that is largely credited in finally breaking a white man's power in Kenya. And yet, with independence, or at independence, its actors are denied a seat. So that it no longer, if you want, have any power to influence how it is remembered, especially by the local population. So, in my mind, it points to the different silence. Of course, one can talk about repressed silence, as maybe the actors of the Mau Mau. As Lonsdale tells us, of course, another scholar, that Mau Mau threatens the composure of a state with multiple nationality. So we do understand why what happens with Mau Mau at independence happens. So, in fact, I wonder if this is a silence, because it speaks very loudly, if you want. Maybe you may want to comment on that. What does that portend, really? Secondly, as a Mau Mau scholar, what extent were the local politics you're talking about a reflection of what might have been going on in other areas where Mau Mau was rife? And how does that speak how Kuru is defined, which is really what you're talking about this afternoon? And finally, sorry, I've taken a bit of time. The question of legacy to me is fascinating. And I don't know why we talk about legacy as an event. Because it's a process. And I'd like to think as we sit here, we are trying, we are also contributing now by unmuting the silences to that legacy, right? Because it is shaped over time. It is always a work in the making. And I don't know if you'd want to agree with me that perhaps when we talk about the legacy of Mau Mau, perhaps we are too quick. That's my view. Thank you. Thank you.
Shall I answer? Because it was quite a lot.
Thank you very much, Niels. You know, the significant thing about this seminar today is that we are bringing Mau Mau back to the corridors of the University of Nairobi. Many years back, we couldn't have such opportunity for some reasons. So thank you for helping us to bring Mau Mau back, or the study of it, I think, to where it belongs. Now, unlike Maggie who spoke, I'm no expert of Mau Mau issues. But I was a little bit excited when you started talking about the subaltern approach. It took me back to the mid-90s as a student in Jawaharlal University in New Delhi, where we talked a lot about the subaltern. And I'm sure you know that Indian historians have done quite a bit of work on the subaltern thinking, particularly in analyzing the Indian national movement. And they see through the subaltern eyes, you know, history from below. I remember one of the professors used to say, real history is all local. And that is where my small question is. The Indian historians have tended to see the Indian nationalist movement in terms of strands. They talk about the strands from above and the strands from below. I'm particularly referring to the work of my own teacher, Professor Wanjohi, in his book, The Indian National Movement, Contending Hegemonies. Now, I was just wondering whether you see those strands, particularly when you talk about Mau Mau at the grassroots, at the local levels. Up here, we know that, you know, even the way we appropriate Mau Mau, use or misuse it, is more or less in strands when you look at the elite approach to it. How about at the grassroots? Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so as I was expecting, these are really interesting and detailed questions. So let me begin with Professor Chi's questions. And the first thing I would say is that the fact that the contradictions of Mau Mau are foregrounded in the post-Mau Mau period, I think, is a really useful way of thinking about it. Because the story of Mau Mau as this kind of closed, successful nationalist doesn't tell us anything. Can't tell us anything. It's very difficult. In likelihood, that would have led to a form of civil war. Now, I'm not in the business of counterfactuals, but I think we have to accept that some way in which the legacies of this like explosion of violence had to be managed. Now, the way it was managed, as I hope I pointed out, was extremely negative for the future because it strangled a form of grassroots politics in the cradle. And I think Kenya to this day struggles with the fact that politics is to be something that's done to people. But I think that comes from the fact that many and forgetting. And that links to your question, is there really a silence here? Now, there is a silence, but not in the way that people have talked about it. I think the assertion that Mau Mau was silent or forgotten is incorrect. I gave you the example of Kimathi Street, but Mau Mau isn't absent from the newspapers of independent Kenya. They are referred to no longer as Mau Mau, they're referred to as freedom fighters. That's something that only happens after 1963. There is a level of incorporation. Otherwise, Kenyatta wouldn't have pictured himself with Field Marshal Mariama 2 days after Kenya's independence. He wasn't afraid of embracing Mau Mau to a certain extent. But what was silenced, and this is the crucial point, what was silenced was what you might call the political project of Mau Mau. Free land, this kind of view that chiefs and headmen and the kind of executive administration shouldn't be in charge, but instead it should be a sort of grassroots, elected committees and things like that. And I actually think in the post-independence period, there is a battle between those views in places like Nyeri. If you read the correspondence in the KNA, so much of it is conflict between chiefs, who may even not be kind of old loyalists, but are newly elected chiefs, but a battle between the old colonial provincial administration as a way of governing and local Kanu branches that claim that they have the right to govern. And that battle between those two definitions, I think, is one of the silences that comes out. Because in so much of the historiography, so much of the political science about Kenya, the kind of bureaucratic executive state. But the bureaucratic executive state was contested at the local level by these people. So on the point as well about legacies, I agree 100%. Legacies are a process, they aren't an event. I can remember that line because I think it's very good. Did Mau Mau ever die? Did we ever stop processing the legacies of it? I don't think so, because the people, while they may have died, they began strains of thought, were repressed, sometimes they were embraced, and sometimes this happened, and this is why my point about Mungiki is relevant, because sometimes this happened not in this idealized democratic way. Sometimes subalterns are violent, and that brings me on to the final question, which is about the subaltern approach. And this actually goes to answer the first question I thought about, the over-reliance on British sources. Because one of the most important works of subaltern school scholarship is about both can the subaltern speak, but also the prose of counterinsurgency, which is that sources from the colonial period are shaped by this overarching counterinsurgency project. That doesn't mean that as historians we shouldn't try and read these sources and try and tease out what actors on the ground actually want. And that's why I think the subaltern school, I disagree with it to the extent that it sometimes says we can't recover the voices of these people. I think it's difficult, and as historians we need to acknowledge our limitations sometimes. But sometimes we can't recreate history exactly as it was. But if we accept our limitations, we can still say something very important. And on the second part of your question about kind of contending hegemonies, contending strands of nationalism, I think that goes exactly to the heart of what I've been trying to say. Is that there is a strand for Mau Mau in Kenya's national history. It just ends too quickly. It ends when the fighting stops, because that's convenient. Because then it can become this sort of, it can mean everything to anyone. Whereas if you consider the fact that it was still having an active impact on policy deep into the post-independence period, suddenly it becomes much harder to sort of put it into a neat box. And I think that the strand, the Mau Mau strand, the Mau Mau ideology, and calling it Mau Mau is problematic, I think, because there were a lot of people that weren't involved in Mau Mau that did also believe in this ideology. Wanjohi Mungau, the main character of my talk today, wasn't a member of Mau Mau in the sense that he was a terrorist in the forest. He was still involved in that ideology, and I think that retains. Now, there are other questions to be asked here, which I won't go into in too much detail, but there's an extent to which, say, the activism of Odinga and the KPU, what extent were they relating Mau Mau ideas? And I think I don't have the answer for that today, but I think it would be interesting to think about the competing strands and how they stretch beyond the 1963 moment. I think it's too easy to think, because this is the image that the Kenyatta state wanted to produce, right? Is that everything came together on the 12th of December, 1963. One flag came down, another flag came up, and the nation was unified. And the reality is, of course, that it wasn't. And the fact that people like Mungau were being sent to prison a few months after independence, I think is the ultimate proof of that.
Yes, David, other question?
Let me just start by saying today I've learned quite a number of things. Just like Mwalimu Mbongi said, some of us are not really experts in this field. So this is our country, and we want to know this history. I think we know very little about this history. Today I've learned quite a number of things that I've never even imagined. But I want to just pick on something that Margaret raised or commended, and then you may have forgotten to address it. I think just before she stopped talking, she asked about what the other areas where Mau Mau is also known to have been active were doing. Because your talk focused largely on the area around Nyeri. For example, where I was born, where I come from, almost every family had somebody in the Mau Mau. What was going on with those people, for example? Thank you.
I really loved your discussion. However, I came in a bit late, but I hope I didn't miss so much. I've heard you talk about royalists, but I would have actually been interested to know perhaps what was your research or maybe your discovery with regards to the role religion played in perhaps what the role of religion in being a loyalist. Because you had to perhaps embrace the education, or perhaps you had to embrace the religion. Yes, thank you.
Very good questions. Yes. So what's happening in other areas? The thing is, the reason I picked Nyeri for this talk is because that was a way to keep it manageable, and I still think that I could have talked for another 45 minutes. So basically, there are dynamics like this happening all over the region, but slightly differently. So to give the example of, say, Kiambu, in Kiambu, the local party, the Kiambu Freedom Party, is entirely dominated by ex-detainees. So they're much more active in formal politics. You don't get the Atangiri, you don't get this kind of subversive society that emerges afterwards. But on the other hand, that means that they're much more, also because it's much more close to Nairobi, they're much more linked to the kind of the national political scene, which happens in interesting ways. In the Rift Valley, I mean, a whole chapter of my thesis is going to be dedicated to what happens in the kind of Eastern Rift, because they have this whole new organization that emerges around 1961 called the Kenya Land Freedom Army, which is basically, in my observation, an organization of resident laborers on white farms who are terrified that the kind of willing buyer, willing seller deal is going to mean that they will get evicted. And they form this kind of defensive ethnic, and that is what it is, ethnic organization to protect themselves, in particular from other groups that might start evicting them from places like Uasin Gishu. And this happens, right? This is the genealogy of 2007. The first time that Kikuyu are being evicted from Rift Valley Farms is in the early 60s. And so the aftermath of Mau Mau and the beginning of that history are completely intertwined. Again, I could have done the whole presentation just about that, but just to give one small example. Several Kadu leaders use the fact that the Kikuyu are oathing and they are forming these subversive organizations in order to get their followers to evict Kikuyu from farms in the Western Rift, right? So the history of post-Mau Mau and the history of the whole problems of post-colonial Kenya are really intertwined. Now, this history obviously stretches to other places. Nairobi has a very interesting history as well, because many ex-detainees end up supporting Tom Mboya over Dr. Wayaki in the 1961 by-election. And that history, I think, is particularly interesting as well. And I haven't done enough research into that. But yes, essentially all over central Kenya, there are local versions of this story happening in different ways. And I think that's important to know. Now, the question about, first of all, just generally about loyalism. We've got to understand that the people there are mostly not be explicitly in the Home Guard, but had sat out the emergency and were reaping the benefits. And the point you made about religion and about education is so crucial. And this was the big thing I've taken away from my. I've only done a few interviews. But when I speak to people who remember the legacies of this period, who remember, say, the late 1950s, the 1960s, the thing that has come forward the most is that people remember the economic differences that were created by the emergency. One woman in a village in Moranga, and this was very striking to me, when she described relationships between loyalists and people that weren't loyalists, what she pointed towards were her clothes, because the loyalists were the ones that could wear nice Western clothing, whereas their children had to go around barefoot, right? But the economic differentiation that was produced by the emergency led to an educational disparity, because you couldn't send your children to school if you didn't have any money. And that led to this working out of effects, a sort of butterfly effect that still affects people till today. And that's why it's difficult. And that's why, to go to one of the first questions I had, which is dealing with legacies is a process, it's not an event. People still to this day feel that their lives have been shaped by what happens in the period.
Thank you very much for a nice presentation. Maybe my interest will be the silent voice of the Kisii gun-making people who contributed in the fight. It seems to be silent. And you also have acknowledged that most of the sources that you use majorly British voices. We have the newspapers written in vernacular, like Terere, Utiriwa Nyeri. They also bring out the stories. Very significant. The right to hide some point from British. Thank you.
I'm interested in biography. Who was Mungau? Who was Mungau? You talk of an elite group in Nyeri. Was he part of the elite group, or was he from the subaltern?
Really good questions again. So is that I should put my hands up, and it's not because I haven't looked, because I know that Mau Mau was quite prominent in that area. But the thing is that it's sometimes it's a numbers game, which is the sense of if the local administrators don't feel that this is an element of what's going on afterwards, even when there's crimes going on, even when there's clothing going on, they don't identify it as linked to Mau Mau legacies. And this is a really big problem with trying to discover silent histories, I feel like this is going to be a theme that we get over the weeks, which is that unless people identify something as something that's worth studying, as something that's worth writing about, it doesn't get recorded. But I will say one thing, which is that I know that the Kenya Land Freedom Army, this organization that exists in the Rift Valley, also exists among the Kisi in 61. There definitely is a history there, and as I go forward, it's definitely something I want to look at more. Secondly, your point about vernacular newspapers. I have actually already identified them as a great source. It literally is just about getting the kind of resources together to translate them and use them and find a place where they are easily available. But I completely agree that they're an excellent source. And actually that links to the next question, because we don't know that much about Mungau, but one thing that we do know is that the way, when he's described as him coming to prominence, it's to do with journalism. It's the fact that he published a local newspaper in Swahili, which I think is an interesting part of the story as well. And that he was, so I would describe him as someone who was really educated. He wasn't like Keanu, sort of proper elite. I'd say that I would describe him as the middle of society. And that actually links me to a bigger point, which is that the real stories from below are incredibly difficult to tell. The only way you can really tell them oral histories, even the oral histories, are shaped by larger narratives. One experience I think is very telling, and many of you will have done oral histories, but I find when you try and ask someone about something that they don't have direct experience from, they'll still give you an answer. But the answer that they give is one that draws on a national narrative. For instance, in the interviews I've done, Kenyatta comes up constantly. Whenever I ask about reconciliation, always about Kenyatta. Now, I believe that Kenyatta's speeches did have an impact on people, and I think we need to really discuss Kenyatta's sort of reconciliation discourse. The average person won't have heard one of these speeches. I think that when they get a question about a concept that they haven't maybe thought about before, they give you the sort of mainstream narrative, which makes it very difficult sometimes to get a very local perspective. I think what the colonial sources show us, they show us more than the big national narratives, but it never can go that deep. And that's why I think some memoir, I mentioned Gucci Koyo's memoir, and that was actually based on an oral history that a Western historian transcribed. But that is a pure subaltern story, because he becomes a criminal. He becomes like a gangster robbing people and getting put in jail for a completely separate offense. That actually to another difficulty I have, which is, when is an armed robbery an armed robbery, and when is it post Mau Mau activism? Right? And this is a problem that comes when you try to do history from below. There is a lot of scholarship on kind of peasant rebellions and peasant resistance and the way in which subaltern groups resist. And I actually think that scholarship might be quite interesting for me to look at. It's hard to find sources, because if I'm reading a criminal report, what do I circle? What do I take a note? Like, I think it's very important. I think one of the things that's interesting about this series is talking about what the actual practices of a historian are. And particularly when, in my case, you're dealing with a huge volume of sources, how do you identify what counts as post-Mau Mau activism?
Let's hear from Professor Wahome, please.
Thank you, George. One of the issues that characterize Mau Mau, and I hope the speaker mentioned, I think the network has been problematic. That is one of the issues. But beyond that, one of the issues is that there is a lot of secrecy. There is that dominance brought out of the elite, which is very common in Kenyan history, that the elite have shaped the history of Kenya continuously up to the present. But there is some kind of silence, hidden information that seems to be probably hidden because of the oath that were taken during the Mau Mau. Did you encounter something like that? Particularly when interviewing people, did the oath come out as a main barrier to information. Thank you, and thank you for a good presentation. Thank you.
The audiences, the activists, they have the votes as well, because they're the ones that vote in the reserve district. So they're absolutely crucial to that side of the story. And secondly, they were activists in these organizations, but as the questioner rightfully pointed out, they're then excluded in the sources. But one point that I'll bring out, I didn't have time to talk about it, but the whole chapter of my thesis is going to be dedicated to kind of politics within KANU. And we know a lot about the youth wing and the youth wing's kind of activism. Often in the same sentence with youth wing activism is also mentioned the women's wing. KANU Women's Wing was also seen as a radical element of the movement. They also had a lot of these ideas. And that's pretty easy to explain because the amount of widows in central Kenya at this time is something that really hasn't been discussed in the scholarship. The amount of orphans, the amount of families that are completely shattered by 8 years of this kind of violence. So I would go so far as saying as women were more affected by men because they didn't have that outlet go away quite as often. They were also targeted in another way. This is an argument that I've been playing around with and I haven't consolidated yet. But I think one of the ways in which reconciliation happens is that the patriarchal moral project continues. I'll give you the example. There's a group in central Kenya at the time called the Kikuyu Welfare Association. The main thing that the Kikuyu Welfare Association does is repatriate prostitutes from Nairobi back to the reserve. They beat up people that are drinking too much beer. Essentially, they're moral arbiters. But they include, and I can prove this, they include both ex-detainees and ex-loyalists, because the big loyalist organization in Nakuru, the Torchbearers, dissolves itself to become part of the Kikuyu Welfare Association. So what I think we have here is Kikuyu men reconciling around a moral project to control Kikuyu women. So that would be a way of, I think, bringing that side of the story. I still need to do more research on that.
Two questions from the chat on those online. Kefa Demba is asking, Niels, your topic alludes to a resurgence of Mau Mau movement. Could this have been instigated by the colonial government motivation to disrupt Kenya's quest for independence? And Fidelis Makali asks, in the post-independence era, what can you attribute this silence to? Was it actually a silence or politics of amnesia, with Meta's assertion that Mau Mau was disease, which had been eradicated and must never be remembered again? How does the post-colonial state's attitude towards Mau Mau feature in this discourse?
Those are two really great questions. Now, the first question of those, like, did the colonial government instigate this, is a really excellent question. And the reason is because that's what a lot of people thought at the time, particularly this Kenyan Land Freedom Army. Basically, a lot of the top-tier politicians, Odinga and Mboya in particular, spread the rumor that these are actually white farmers who are giving their own workers the equipment to do oaths and to build arms. Now, I think there's a lot of evidence that this isn't true, in part because there are documents in the files produced by members of this organization, the Kenyan Land Freedom Army, and their existence is quite natural if you look at the historical processes that are going on. But it is very important to recognize that the fact that there were Kenyans at the time who said, oh no, this is just some European plot to discredit independence, what that does is show us how there was already a major debate going on at the time about the meanings of Mau Mau. Because if you can say this organization is just a European plot, that means that you are so against it that you can't even countenance its independent existence. It goes to the divisions that exist at the time. Now, the last question is the big question, which is why did the post-colonial state encourage this silencing of the legacies? Now, I think that the attitude of the Kenyatta state to Mau Mau is endlessly ambiguous and complex. For instance, the quote that it was an illness is countenanced, on the other hand, by quite a lot of places where ex-freedom fighters are invited to public ceremony. Kenyatta's private bodyguard is Mau Mau. So the ambiguity of that, I think, can be explained by the fact that the project of reconciliation was a project that was supposed to partially incorporate it, but therefore neutralize it. It was supposed to be incorporated in a safe way, in a way that wouldn't hamper power of the sort of post-colonial elite. And the second element of that that's quite important, and this is where the 1969 oathing comes in, because in the 1969 oathing, Kenyatta directly utilizes Mau Mau oath administrators to organize those oaths. And I think what that goes to show is that healing the divisions in the Kikuyu tribe is also an ethnic nationalist project. It's a way in which he can build his power base when things become threatened. In 1969, the tribe is painted as being under threat, after the assassination of Tom Mboya, after threats in the Rift Valley again. And who does that oathing affect in the worst way? Who are the people that get killed during that oathing? There's one famous case of a Presbyterian church elder that gets killed in 1969 because they refused the oath the way they refused the oath in the 1950s. So the link between the silences and this attempt to use the phrase I used before, shore up the Kikuyu lager, definitely exists. And that's maybe a good point to sort of round that off is, in a lot of this story, there are no good guys. Like this, on the one hand, a lot of these ex-Mau Mau resorted to violence, resorted to effectively racketeering. On the other hand, the Kenyatta state was also violent and repressed. And that's why I think narrative of sort of heroes and villains isn't very productive. Yeah, it's very important. And I think we can endlessly talk about the kind of creating of national myths, because this is in part central to that process.
We have had a great afternoon. Could you just consult the Kenya News Agency offices at Uchumi House? That would be a good source for you. At Kenya News Agency, they have really a good collection. Yeah, Kenya News Agency, they have an office. They have digitized actually their material. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Dr. Gachehi to give us a word of appreciation. Thank you.
Sincerely for looking at some of those silences that surround local politics of Kenya's struggle for independence through the voice of former loyalists, former freedom fighters, but also the loyalists and others in the so-called Mau Mau crowd. That is what we call them. Now, silences in history are indeed a very intriguing subject. They are a very intriguing voice that allure us, its mystery, to examine the why and what behind that silence. I like to remember the works of Jacques Depoche in his work Silences in African History, and where he notes that uncovering silences is not just a question of going after the facts that have triggered direct or indirect silences, but also the measure of what has caused silences. And for the historian, this is very important, because the silence no longer a silence, a research gap. In my view, it speaks to the research program. Yeah? Why is there a silence? Right? A very good point. And clearly, like you rightly noted, there are all sorts of silences. We have repressed silences in Mau Mau. We have others that are tactical. They decide to be silent, for survival perhaps. Last week, we were listening to something about soldiers caught up in the 1982 coup. And a lot of them are silent. And it's because they don't feel safe yet to speak about their story. Others are convenient silences. In my view, they are very measured. It to be told another day. So, in the famous play that depicts the life of Thomas More, someone says there that there are many kinds of silences. I totally agree with that. And this therefore suggests that although historians are always the poorer for those silences, so how can we begin to understand the Mau Mau, for example, if the loyalists do not speak? It remains a half-broad story. And therefore the importance of gathering the silences, those gaps, so that we have a more rounded, a more comprehensive story that it is that we are looking for. Indeed, again, Deposhin says that silence is not always a sign of powerlessness. Again, we need to think about that as we attribute some value to the silences as historians. But do not keep silent because they're powerless. We need to investigate these silences. And therefore, I would say that our series of unbundling, or is it unveiling silences, could not have come at a better time. Especially concerning the liberation war, that was the Mau Mau, which we have witnessed a reawaking of recent times, going by the publications that we have seen, and the debate maybe in a more friendly, conducive political dispensation. But we are talking about things that we have not talked about for a very long time. So, Bwana Chairman, we are hitting the road when it's hot. And I think that's the way it should be. We should take full advantage of the goodwill to begin to talk about things that we may not have talked about for a very long time, and what it means, especially to the public memory of this country, as Professor Branch also put the import of these things that we are talking about, of Mau Mau, for example, which we are talking about, to the collective memory of our independent state. And therefore, maybe I would like to end this vote of thanks again by remembering the French philosopher Renan, who says that other histories can be produced by asking different questions of new evidence. Very important, yeah? That other histories can be produced. And I hope we are the people who do this. Produce new histories by asking different questions of new evidence. For Mau Mau, where are we going to find this new evidence? I'm very poor in mathematics, but I was calculating as I sat back there, very elementary mathematics. That if a freedom fighter went to the forest at 20 years, and that's very young, 70 years later, he would be 95, right? So we are talking about history slipping from our hands. Somebody did ask you about your sources. And we all know that you cannot defeat first-hand accounts of who are there, because we rely a lot of times on secondary evidence, that which has been written. So we need to make haste if we are going to do justice to these silences that we are talking about. Just to remember that other histories can be produced, which are our new evidence. What other histories can we write about? Loyalists, the Mau Mau crowd, and so on and so forth. I think that, in sum, is a summary of the task we have set up ourselves in this department of history and archaeology. And we want, in our quest to unbundle silences in Kenya's history. We want to ask new questions. We want to look to where those questions lead us and whether we can have new histories. The same old subjects that we have been talking about. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Thank you to our viewers for being there, for a very good afternoon, and we look forward to seeing all of you next week after. Thank you very much.
Thank you.